Welcome to Create the Future, the podcast where we explore how entrepreneurship can be a force for solving society's greatest challenges. I'm your host, Jeff Reid. I'm the founding director of the Georgetown University Entrepreneurship Initiative. Let's dive into the world of visionary entrepreneurs and forward-thinking leaders who are proving that you don't need to choose between doing good and doing well. Together, we'll uncover stories, strategies, and insights that show how companies built on purpose can also achieve lasting profitability and impact. So whether you're a business leader, a founder, a student, or simply someone curious about creating meaningful change, this is your space to learn how entrepreneurship can create a better future for all. On today's episode, we're excited to cover this foundational concept of entrepreneurship for the common good. And we have two amazing guests with us today. They share a love of food, especially high quality food. They also have connections, both of them, to Boston and to DC, and they bring a lot of values into the work they do. So please join me in welcoming Dan Simons, co-founder of the Founding Farmers Group, and Bill Creelman, the founder of Spindrift, to today's podcast. Bill, Dan, welcome. How are you guys?
Doing great. Thanks, Jeff. Nice to see you.
Good.
So
Thanks,
welcome
Jeff.
to you
Thanks for
both.
having us.
Yeah, great to see you both. I'm going to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey, and then we're going to engage in some conversation around our core topics here. And I'll start with Bill. Bill has a history of as a Georgetown student and a serial entrepreneur. And Bill, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, how did you come to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for inviting me to the inaugural podcast. I guess the starting point for me is really just a love of food. So I was very lucky to grow up in Western Mass in a town and a family that celebrated food. Um, I took that interest through all the way to Georgetown. I was fortunate to take a class with the great Walter Benson, who taught, I think, one of the very first entrepreneurship classes in the United States.
And that
And
class was that was called Entrepreneurship. It was the
it
only
was
class we
called,
had on that.
it was the only one. And I've done a little informal research on this. I think I shared with you, and I think there was maybe two programs that were ahead of Georgetown. So, big, but it had a big impression on me. And I went on to work in fishing industry. I'd been in the fishing industry, started a brand out of school called Nantucket Harvest, and really the idea for me has always been celebrating local food and trying to connect food and people and kind of health and wellness and trying to find an intersection point. And the early business, Nantucket Harvest, was not terribly successful, but it taught me a lot about, how to operate a business, kind of almost like an early MBA program. And from there, pivoted to a brand called Stirrings, which was the first kind of better for you cocktail mix uh, in the United States, as kind of people were starting to become more aware of ingredients and what they're putting in their bodies, even with cocktails. And then, as you mentioned, I eventually went on to found Spindrift, which is really a celebration of a lot of that kind of history all in one. Working with farmers, using ingredients that you would recognize and know from your fridge or your local farmers market, and turning that into a sparkling beverage. So lots of cuts and bruises along the way, but always connected with really this idea of using ingredients that I had known growing up that could be used very easily in a meal, and not just a sparkling water. And that was kind of the inspiration.
And it's been a remarkable journey. I know the ups and downs of those earlier startups. You were able to sell Stirrings, I think, to Diageo, I'm not sure if I said that right, but
Yeah,
uh,
that's right.
and now Spindrift is now retailed in thousands of locations, and you're selling millions of units every year. You had a recent new transaction where some investors came in and really gave another huge vote of support and confidence for the brand. Does it feel like you've made it yet?
Well, this is the food and beverage business is a tough business. I mean, everyone, especially it seems as though all the big strategics, these companies that we're competing against all have an advantage on scale, on purchasing. Many of them have networks that are, hundreds of years old, literally. So I don't know that you ever feel like you've sort of hit a resting point. And in fact, I think it's dangerous to ever think that you've reached some like green pastures that you can now relax in. I always say that other than fashion, food and beverage is like the fastest moving space. I think the big thing we try to do is anchor around sort of principles. We want to be a healthier brand. We want to use ingredients we don't necessarily want to come out with the next kind of trendy ingredient. That in my experience has been a little bit dangerous. So I think we've made amazing progress, but still feel like we've got a long way to go.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. Dan, let's hear a little bit about the origins of your entrepreneurial journey and kind of the unique way that you and your team have built the Founding Farmers restaurants.
So thanks for having me. And I will answer that question. I just have to say, as I listened to Bill say that, it's just scary. Entrepreneurship is like, I don't know if you're ever done. I worry that, every day is just one day closer to our next failure. That's like, I wake up, like, that's how I wake up feeling. It's not that but apparently I love that feeling. Like, that's sort of this question of, have you made it or do you celebrate? I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, and sure, I know there are, it makes the front page of the newspaper. Someone has some huge exit, they make $100 gazillion, and now they can just buy a plane and buy a boat, and they don't ever have to work again. I guess some people, that's maybe like making it in one sense. But for those of us still running our companies, we're getting our ass kicked on the daily. And I'm not like necessarily bringing Bill down to my level that he's getting his ass kicked like I am, but I'll take you back to the beginning for us. But today it's, Founding Farmers restaurants, our company, just over 1,600 employees, over $100 million a year in annual sales, 8 restaurants, a full service catering and events company, a small distillery, which really we focus just on internally supplying ourselves. Same thing with our own bakery. And now our own production center where we make all our chocolate and all our coffee. And it just started, 17 years ago with an idea of, hey, maybe we could. And we got to where we are today, and I got to where our team is today, one step at a time, never a straight line, never necessarily a step that we understood. Every step forward we thought we were taking might have been a step to the side or a step backwards or not even a step at all. And so it can look from the outside like companies have achieved a certain thing, but I think the interesting thing is what's on the inside. So I'm happy to talk about that. But I'm 55 years old, so I was like born and raised north of Boston, small town. I think the relevant part for my entrepreneurial journey is I was lucky enough to grow up in a really good family. I'm the youngest of 4. My parents were great immigrants to America. And that's really where I got my roots of, I love to be part of a team. And I see that working together, I could accomplish, especially for me as the youngest, and probably the least skilled in many categories and in many ways compared to my siblings. The only way we could win, I could win, was to win together. Team, family, team sports, team at work, etc. So I worked at bars and restaurants all through college. I had dreams. I filed for my first patent and didn't get it when I was in college. I thought I wanted to be an inventor. I knew I wanted to be some sort of entrepreneur. My parents were doctors. I knew I didn't want to do that. Ironically, I thought they worked too hard. I'm like, they work 7 days a week. They're always on call. Their pager's always going off. Why would anybody want to do that? And then I fell in love with bars and restaurants, busted tables, making drinks, slinging booze. And then I worked for TGI Fridays while I was an undergrad. And I got to see like, wow, this restaurant thing, there's real companies and real jobs. And they offered me a job to go into management after I graduated. And I spent the next 12 years working for other people. So I was 33 years old before I became an entrepreneur. I had dreams and business plans and ideas and little things along the way. And then joined forces with my now and still and forever business partner when I was 33. And then we started a consulting firm, and our first restaurant failed. So again, it's, these are, I think, the important parts of the story. Bill, I didn't know that you did stirrings. That's awesome. So I was a customer of yours with that product, and I was so impressed. I'm like, wow, someone finally cared about ingredient quality in this space. And so that's, we made our mistakes. First restaurant failed, got really lucky. We'd started a consulting firm, met the farmers from North Dakota, the North Dakota Farmers Union. They wanted to invest in restaurants really as a vertical integration strategy and storytelling advocacy on behalf of American family farmers. This was the early 2000s. Corporate ag was just crushing family farmers. And they have continued, and corporate ag has, in my view, like a successful virus, they've basically destroyed everything else, including most family farmers. So we joined forces, and we, even including after our first restaurant failure, and then our restaurateurship experience and these American family farmers, that we wove that into DNA, and that's what created the first founding farmers. So we're the restaurateurs, they're our farmer partners, they're really our biggest capital partner, and we have mission-driven capital, and that's what planted the seeds for everything that followed.
Thanks so much for that. And it is a great and unique story, right? Your first restaurant was over near the World Bank, not too far from the GW campus, and that ownership structure, the whole reason you've got the name Founding Farmers and Farmer Owned is prominently displayed behind you right now on the screen. And that is a unique kind of value proposition for your business. Can you talk about how that has, been an asset for you and maybe how it created challenges that you've had to overcome over the years?
Capital comes with strings attached. Every business needs capital. So for us, we are incredibly fortunate. Yes, we have investors. Their capital comes with strings attached, or let's call it strings, reins, like they can yank the reins to the left, they can yank the reins to the right. Capital always has usually legal power in your operating agreements and in your documents. And if not structural and legal power, at a minimum, capital has intense influence. And so for us, this capital comes with the character and values of American family farmers who think in a multi-generational way and who are more interested in year to year to decade performance than they are in quarterly results. And so our capital I don't have quarterly pressure, never had, never will, because I have no interest in running a public company. These words may haunt me one day, and then great, I will have to resign if we go public because I don't want to run a public company. So it's interesting, Jeff, the way you asked that question. How has that been, and did it ever come with downsides? It's never come with downsides. It is values-centric capital. Well, I guess all capital is value-centric. That capital gets to decide its own values, but it's a multi-stakeholder approach. We do need to be profitable, and they invest in order to generate a return. And that return is measured both in cash-on-cash returns, enterprise value, and enterprise impact. And they are all shoulder to shoulder as what our mission is. And so as we make decisions every day, we use this guiding principle of through the eyes of the farmer. So and a little bit in a stereotypical way. What do farmers care about? The land they give to their kids, their community. When your nearest neighbor is kind of far away, you better have a good relationship with them because you might need some help. And so there's a lot of ways that we think of how do we see our business and our decision making through the eyes of the farmer. And so that's what's guided us all this way.
Thanks so much. So, Bill, you've had different businesses and different types of capital raising. Can you share how you manage the relationship between your investors and then your role as the leader, founder, CEO of a business, and how does that create tension? Have you had challenges around trying to serve what you thought was best versus what your investors maybe thought was best?
I've done it both ways, so I go back now almost 30 years, trying to start, hopefully disruptive businesses in food and beverage. And 30 years ago, there was no capital really available. There were a few small groups, and you could find them. You could maybe get an audience. So in the beginning, we borrowed money from friends and family. We borrowed money on our credit cards, and then I eventually borrowed from the towns that we were in, New Bedford and Fall River in Massachusetts. And so that was capital source one. It came with a ton of challenges. I mean, there were, you can imagine where you're reporting to a town on how you're doing on a whatever cadence, quarterly, annual basis, and you had covenants you had to maintain. Both of those had hiring requirements associated with it. So for every X that you borrowed, you had to make sure you hired a certain number of people. So fast forward to, what I learned, I think to Dan's point, the most important thing, and it doesn't matter who the stakeholder is, it can be the people you're borrowing money from, it can be your employees, it can be your vendors, it can be your consumers on some level. Like, you have to have alignment on your value system, and that is not something you can decide to do like halfway in or change along the way. I mean, you really have to be, particularly as the leader, whatever that means, either someone that started the business or the CEO or even anyone on the leadership team. Like, you have to have everyone marching in the same direction. And that isn't just, like, to make sure you all get along and you can sleep at night. The end result of the business will only be as good as the alignment among that team. And so in the case of investors, you have to set a very clear goal and say, okay, well, for the next 5 years or 10 years, we want to go from X to Y, and that's great. But the way we're going to do it is by doing all of these things that hopefully that have risk associated with them, but we all are holding hands and taking that risk together. I think the second thing that gets missed as an early entrepreneur was that, investors should really be adding value too. Great investors are not just someone you report to every, 12 weeks. They should also be coming to you with ideas and making introductions and saying, hey, have you thought about this? So I misunderstood that early on. I thought it was, like a student teacher relationship where you just, got graded and you tried to stay out of their way. I towards with Spindrift, especially, I would give our investors as much credit for the success we've had as I would any other member of the team.
Yeah, you've both talked about multiple people being involved. Bill, you were just talking about investors and it is often entrepreneurship is often seen as a solo activity. But I think you both can share, or will you both share how it is a team effort, how it's not just one person in charge. Maybe you have to make some of the toughest decisions as the person in charge, but it's not just you. You have employees that matter. You have investors and other members that can advise you and help you. Can you guys share some examples of how, some days it might have seemed lonely, but there were others along the way that helped you out? And I'll let Dan start that one, and then you guys can both kind of add to each other.
So a little inside baseball about my personality. I don't like to be alone. Uh, I'm fine being alone, but I don't like it. And I never choose it. Like, I love to ski, and even on a fresh powder day, I'm looking around like, who wants to go? Now, as long as one person will go with me, then I'm not waiting for anybody else to get up. And I would ski fresh powder alone, but I'd be a little sad the whole time that I wasn't doing it with someone. So that's just how I live my life. You know, when I'm going to run my errands, if I have to go like pick up something at CVS, I'm like looking around the house, like, anybody want to come with me? And so I love having a business partner. My partner Mike was actually my boss in the early years, some of that first decade of working for others, and then we worked apart. So always stayed in touch, and then we joined forces and became partners. So we go back a long way. Um, it, Relationships for me are where the value gets created. Uh, I love 1 + 1 = 3 as a mindset, and that's very hard to create one plus if there isn't something like, what am I adding to me? I think as a person, I have appropriately high self-esteem. I feel good about myself. And when it comes to business challenges, my first instinct is that I'm not enough. You know, I trust myself in my decisions, but why wouldn't I want to do this collectively? Even if through the collective and the bantering, maybe my decision turns out to be the one in that moment. But how would I know that unless I was with a team that got to kick it around and to tear it apart and debate it and potentially be additive to it? Um, and the reason why I started off by talking about my personality, I don't think partnership is for everyone. I don't think anything that works for one necessarily works for others. So I don't share partnership as advice. I share the the looking in the mirror, like when Bill talked about values alignment, you know, with investors. It's seeing these things up front. And I think with entrepreneurship and probably in life, if you can do the work to get to know yourself and look for some of that clarity, then I think that helps you understand, am I built for a partnership? If so, what type of partner? You know, my partner is very different than me. We're different generations, we have different personalities, we have some different strengths, but we overlap really well on values and character and what's important to us. I have other friends that are entrepreneurs that are not in partnerships. They should not be in partnerships, and they have wonderful companies with a wonderful culture, and they do wonderful things. So I just share there. The more you know yourself, the more likely you are to put yourself into the most value creative relationships.
Yeah, I guess I would follow up on that, Jeff and Dan. I mean, so in our space, we entered a category that was very old and had very well established leaders, and we knew it was going to be really challenging to compete. I'm talking about brands like LaCroix, Pellegrino, Polar. I mean, brands that had been around for our youngest competitor was 50 years old, and so the way I thought about team and bringing on partners or investors or building our management team was we had everything kind of stacked against us, and we needed the best ideas to come forward to win. And I think it's not the instinct of an entrepreneur necessarily to bring people around them that are better at doing what they do than they are. Usually there's a hard-headedness to them. um, but I had luckily made a number of early mistakes and knew that I needed a team that was going to be able to complement and collectively collaborate to come up with the best answer. Um, and that really is what the role of strategic partners has been for us. With each kind of stage of the business, we've come to an impasse where we had to figure out, do we go right or left? And I think having smart people that are incredibly good at what they do, collaborative, at the table is really the only reason we've been able to continue to compete, with these incumbents that seemingly have everything figured out well ahead of us.
You know, we often hear from entrepreneurs that there's a loneliness challenge. Even if you are around people all day, whether it's a ski slope or a business meeting, even if you're around your customers, your team members, there can be a sense of loneliness because everybody's counting on you, and you have to kind of have your happy face on all the time, and it's tough sometimes to be vulnerable. So I want to ask you, and I know, Dan, you've been open about some of this, like how is vulnerability a strength in your sense, and how does that go against sometimes what we think of and hear, that entrepreneurs are these almost superhuman people with great talent and skills, and they always have all the answers? How does that ring for you, and how have you managed that as a part of being a human being?
So let's do a little myth busting. There are no superpowered human beings. There is no human that doesn't have vulnerabilities. Every human is vulnerable. You can choose to hide that vulnerability, deny it to yourself, lie about it, mask it, but it is one of the wonderful human commonalities that we've all got a brain, and all of our brains have little glitches sometimes, and it's complicated in there. It's what makes us both powerful and weak. And so I would say that for aspiring entrepreneurs or current entrepreneurs, um, there is power and success in actually having your real face on every day, or at least most of the time. I'm not saying sometimes you don't have to, like, grin and deal with it, and like carry on. And, you might feel like complaining the whole time, but you can't just do that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that um, when someone goes through, whether it's clinical anxiety or depression or OCD, I mean, Jeff, the numbers, if we just take American healthcare, the numbers are staggering. Put 100 entrepreneurs in a room, right? And I will just say, okay, great. 22 of you stand over there. Great. You represent the group with anxiety. 11 of you stand over there. You represent the group with some version of a OC, obsessive compulsive disorder. 9 of you stand over there. 3 of you stand over there. Let's talk about suicidal ideation. Like the census of what you're getting with the human condition is no different. I mean, look, we see a higher suicide rate with American family farmers, with veterans of the armed forces, with, we could break it down by profession where things are worse. But there is nowhere across society where you're like, oh yeah, this group of people doesn't ever struggle with some aspect of being human. So I think the powerful approach, what my business has developed plenty of these case studies on, is we invest tactically, culturally, programmatically in helping people um, become the best at being themselves. I'm never trying to fix someone's mental health problem. I'm just trying to say, hey, there it is. Let's name it if it helps to name it. Let's wrap support around it if it helps to wrap support around it. That support can everything from be a shoulder to lean on to clinical therapy appointments to, there's a vast array of support, all of which leads to the best possible performance in the workplace. So for me, it's a clear capitalist's approach. I don't use the phrase the employees are our biggest asset. I just don't like the dehuman part of that phrase. However, I get the point, and I think that phrase is generally used with the best of intentions. But if that is true, and if there is something you can do to squeeze 10% more productivity, less missed days of work, less error rates, higher morale, increased retention out of that asset, you would do it. And that's why we've had such success investing in that. And I like to think, I did a TED talk recently, and it's succeeded my expectations with views and feedback and whatever. And it's all about this topic that you don't have to choose between people and profit in the workplace. And I just love the feedback that I'm hearing with people. So, I've been preaching about this for 25 plus years, sort of like preaching about you should care about where your food comes from. And 20 years ago, people thought we were bonkers to start a restaurant that was around this. And 20 years ago, people thought I was bonkers that I thought we should talk about mental health in the workplace. So I'm glad to see the tide is changing. And I think that there is a future where the taboo and the stigma is just gone. And this is just about human performance, human happiness, human satisfaction.
So I'll turn to our, maybe our core theme for this session, which is around this concept of entrepreneurship for the common good. That's a phrase that we're using at Georgetown to help define what makes our program different than others. And I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll start with Bill. What does that phrase mean to you? Like common good and entrepreneurship. Does that resonate with you? And how do you view that concept?
Yeah, I think it's a really neat way to kind of bring what I know was happening at Georgetown, kind of all these different sort of ideas around what is entrepreneurship and pull it together under a single umbrella. Um, I think, what does that mean for me? I think the main meaning for me is really this idea that if you can do good through building a business the right way, um, that means the people you hire, the way you empower that team, the way your suppliers are treated, kind of the product, all the way up through the investors, and then generate something, whatever that is, goods or service, that goes out into the world and makes the world a little bit better. Um, that you can actually compound all of that and go from good to great. That there's actually a that when kind of all parties win, there's an amplification effect, an exponential effect that allows you to use it as a competitive advantage. I actually, I think the initial, to me, the initial meaning is that you're sort of trying to spread joy in the world, which you are. But I think it would be disingenuous. Dan and I could spend probably the entire time talking about all the challenges we've had. And I think the idea that you're going to start a business strictly around, you know, trying to create value if your business is not making money or is not ultimately going to be sustainable, I think is actually dangerous. So what we've experienced at Spindrift, or what our goal has been, is to try to use empowerment and this idea of kind of uh, creating an ecosystem where everyone wins as a competitive advantage. And that's what's been, I think, what's inspiring to me about the platform, and what I think where we've gotten some of our wins during, especially during some of the more difficult times in the business.
And so, Bill, you've had those tough times and tough decisions. I know that at one point Spindrift had a second product line, and you had to choose to abandon that and focus on one. And there've been different times along the way where you've had to make choices around, what might be profitable versus what might be uh, aligned with your values. Can you share any maybe uncomfortable decisions that you've had to make along the way?
I mean, we, our when your basis is really about disruption, taking what is a common behavior, in this case, a well understood category in sparkling water that was made using a single ingredient, natural flavors, that was always clear, that was always at a certain price point, like all of that kind of stacked together. You're really heading into um, decision after decision that is going to challenge, kind of whatever the common norm was. So we would go to our manufacturers with, you know, 20,000 gallons of our lemon juice or blackberries or what have you, and they would, turn us away because they didn't want to clog their fillers. Or we would go to retail partners with, at the time, a refrigerated product that was, 30% more expensive than whatever they were selling. And we were told no. Like, it almost is like a series of, in almost every turn, you're being told that what you're doing, isn't welcome, isn't appreciated, won't be understood, and therefore please go back and rethink, your proposition and start again. And so I think you culturally, if everywhere you turn, there's going to be a challenge and you're going to be told to sort of restart or think about it differently, you really have to hold hands as a group and make sure that you all agree that what you're doing is important. And so for us, like that, those big moments of compromise, or do we not use single strength lemon juice? Do we use a lemon juice concentrator, lemon flavor? Do we not, do we go with a simpler supply chain decision, or a different way to go to market? And I'm sure Dan has the same trade-off discussion constantly. In food and beverage, it's very common. There's usually like an easy way and the right way. And so, and even today, 15 years, 16 years later, we've really codified the decisions that we're not going to trade on. And I think the thing that's I'm the most proud of is that really our supply chain has actually only gotten, more, has only gotten better, and the quality's only gone up despite a lot of those that seem to be very hard decisions early on.
Thanks for that. Dan, how do you see this concept of, entrepreneurship for the common good?
I I love that Bill said to be cautious about starting off with your primary goal, that some version of doing good. I think that is a really I'm not sure, Bill, what word you use, but it's really risky to think that whatever business you're going to start, that its primary goal and then the thing that you're most focused on is the common good. I don't think that that generally works. That in unto itself is not a business model. I think, I'm not sure, I haven't said this out loud before, but I think that doing a lot, or what you believe is doing a lot of good, is the sort of privilege and the luxury that comes as a result of having built a sound, sustainable business model. And in that case, I don't mean sustainable in an environmental way. I mean a business model that works year after year after year, decade after decade. Your business model, yeah, you have to adapt and change and do that. But building it in from the beginning to know what your values are and to know the sorts of things that you want to accomplish. I think one way to look at it for me is I'm actually trying to do less bad. I mean, the world doesn't really need another restaurant. And so when I build a restaurant, I am, there's fabric, there's materials, there's millwork. I try to get millwork from fallen trees or certified forests. I'd be fooling myself if I think that we don't have a carbon footprint. I can donate money for carbon offsets and say I'm carbon neutral. But, you know, if what we care about is common good for environmental reasons, for me, I have to acknowledge I'm doing some harm. How do I do less harm? Where could I get my harm to zero in an area and how am I defining harm? If you let the general public define harm, you just get kicked around in business. And I get kicked around a lot anyways, like it's just sort of, I'm like, wait, we're trying to do less bad and more good, but we're easy to criticize as a restaurant, I think. Because we're out there consumer facing and telling stories about what we're doing. So I believe that capitalism is one of the most powerful forces to lift up a society and do good. I think it needs to be done consciously. There's behaviors and things I see in capitalism that are just destructive and scare the shit out of me. And I think you need good regulations. And I think sports needs rules and sports need referees. And I think business needs rules and business needs referees. So those are the things that I think about. And we try to have clarity on what are we trying to do that's really good and who's it for? Where are we trying to minimize the things that we know are harmful and that we care about? And then what are we acknowledging that is just like, you can't fight every battle. You can't win on every single front. Someone is going to point out to me that something I do, if your biggest thing is people shouldn't eat animals, then my business does a ton of harm. But at least I could say, hey, I care about this in this way. I know what matters to us, and these are the rules that we're following about animal welfare. We're still going to kill them and eat them, but we're going to do it in a way that we feel is, the most appropriate, or let's call it the least harm. So that's how I put those two things together. I don't want to take the wind out of anybody's sails to start businesses to make the world a better place. I just want those entrepreneurs to actually be successful so that they can make the world a better place. But you do it by having either a product or a problem solution or a new approach to something that people want to pay you for and continue to pay you for.
Yeah, I think that's a great illustration, right? We're not talking about socialism here or starting a nonprofit necessarily. If you don't have a successful, sustainable business model, then you can't have any impact at all, right? But as an entrepreneur, you have a chance to lead and build an organization that does reflect your own values, and yours may be different than the next person, but that's great. At least you have that opportunity to inject your values and make sure that your business shares those. And in that way, I do think entrepreneurs have the ability, as you mentioned, potentially to have the biggest impact on the world might be to start a business that does things that you believe in, right? And that's often what we're talking about here, is this idea that if your goal is to make a huge impact, maybe being an entrepreneur is a way to do it. If you already find yourself tending towards entrepreneurship, make sure that your own personal values are a part of that, so that you don't end up with that disconnect that can happen halfway through the process. So I guess maybe as we start to wind down here, I want to ask you to give a little advice to maybe a Georgetown student or any other person who's aspiring to be an entrepreneur. Yeah, what advice do you have for those folks? And Bill, I'll point out that you were, you've been active at our school. We honored you with one of our Alumni Entrepreneur of the Year awards a few years ago, and we really appreciate you being a role model and contributor in lots of ways. What advice do you have for aspiring entrepreneurs?
The biggest advice that I would give is really to align on what's important early and be somewhat unwavering about it as you go forward. You're inevitably going to be faced with a million decisions every day, and your idea and business plan will morph, continuously. And a lot of that is necessary to survive. But there still should be something that anchors it. We wrote a kind of a document, a one pager that we called the manifesto, because it was about fresh ingredients at the time. And occasionally, I'll pull it out and look at it and see how we're kind of doing against that idea. But the influence that the market can have, that investors can have, that your team can have, that a customer can have, will constantly challenge you to um, veer from what you felt was important. And I just think if you wait too long to put those things in place, and you lose that tether, it's almost impossible to find it again. Um, and uh, and it's such an obvious. It's not the business plan. It's not writing down what you're going to do with an executive summary and all the steps. It's much more the kind of the why. Why did I set out to do this, and what would be an indication that I had gotten really far off course? And we joined 1% for the 15 years ago. Clear. Let's just always make sure that we're thinking about, being a brand that we would have been not today and not as we're anymore. That's sort of the greatest fear I think every founder has, is you sort of suddenly don't recognize yourself in the mirror. It's very easy to do.
Yeah. Dan, how about you? I want to thank you for the engagement you've had with our entrepreneurship programs. I know you're hosting one of our student clubs for lunch in the near future, and you've been supportive of our Pivot program for returning citizens. So as you think about these young people and aspiring entrepreneurs, what advice do you have for them?
I love Bill's. I think that clarity regarding conviction, just to sort of double click on that. I think my advice is focus on your soft skills. Because here's the reality. Your idea is probably not that innovative. And whatever magical skill you have that you think sets you apart from other entrepreneurs, you probably don't have. Simply, but statistically, sure, maybe you're Steve Jobs, in which case, don't worry about your soft skills. Maybe you're Elon Musk, in which case, don't worry about your soft skills. But statistically, you probably aren't Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or any of these like singular outliers. You're probably like me and the vast majority of everybody else, where like that's what statistics are. And so the point of difference is, can you look in the mirror? Can you learn to see through the eyes of others? Do you understand that listening is probably the most important business skill of anything else that you could become a master of? Listening, which to me includes the absorption of nonverbal and all of it, like really absorbing the information from people, including absorbing and understanding people's silence. That is probably, as a category of things, what will make the difference whether your company makes it or not. And we could just theorize that Spindrift and Founding Farmers, Bill said it, his competitors were all 50 years old or more, like entrenched, super hard to disrupt. And it's a beverage. It comes in a vessel. People have to buy it. People have to drink it. Then they have to like it enough to buy it again. Like, he's not in a new space. And his product differentiation is, wow, I'm devoted. By the way, I want you to just listen to this. That's a Spindrift right there. So my point is that I bet that the point of difference of Spindrift versus its competition and why it is disruptive, it's Bill and his people. It's the team leading that company. And yes, the things they have done along the way, and we all know, at least certainly for my company, but probably all of us, it takes some luck. So double down, triple down on your soft skills. Get a coach, get a mirror, videotape yourself and watch it again and again. Tom Brady's got a coach. Venus and Serena have a coach. Like, everybody on their way to greatness has a coach, and the greats keep getting coached. And at some point, those coaches, they can't, throw the ball harder, hit the ball harder. But the coaches, there's mental performance coaches, there's physical performance coaches, there's strategic coaches, there's mental health coaches. There's all of this that you can do. And so I just add on to that, because I think that soft skills don't get fully understood, fully broken down into all of their bits and pieces. And so it gets thrown at people. It's like, work on your soft skills. Like, well, what does that mean? And so the soft skills are really the athleticism of business. And that, I think, is a place that all of us can continue to level up and build our skills and just do a better job and get better results running our companies if we go about it that way.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Bill. I do want to add an additional plug. Dan is the leader of a podcast series called Founded DC that Georgetown Entrepreneurship is a sponsor of, and it highlights stories like these today with a lot of entrepreneurs in our DC area ecosystem. And so if you like this, you might enjoy the WTOP Founded DC podcast as well. Also, if you like this, you might want to come to some other Georgetown entrepreneurship programming. Coming up in November, we have our best student entrepreneurs will be on stage November 5th for our Bark Tank challenge to win a share of $100,000 in the Leonsis Family Entrepreneurship Prize. And then the next day on November 6th, we have our Georgetown Entrepreneurship Summit, which will feature entrepreneurs and leaders telling stories about how entrepreneurship has impacted their lives, what lessons they've learned, and maybe how entrepreneurship can be an incredibly powerful force for the common good. So once again, I want to thank Dan Simons from Founding Farmers Restaurant Group and Bill Creelman of Spindrift. Thank you for being our first guests on this inaugural episode of the Create the Future podcast. Thanks to our audience, and we look forward to seeing you at an entrepreneurial event in the future.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Dan.